In this video, I'll go over postdoc positions and a few things you should think about before you jump into one. If you're watching this video, you probably want to learn a little bit more about postdoc positions, or if you want to use the long name, postdoctoral positions. The point of a postdoc is it happens after your PhD. So you're either about to finish your PhD, congratulations, or you have finished it, double congratulations. And you're curious about what's next, and you might be thinking about postdocs. What is a postdoc? Let's start there. One of the primary purposes of a postdoc is to give you additional training. So when you completed your PhD, you hopefully have developed a very deep but narrow expertise. You might be really good at a certain method. You might know a lot about a population. If you're in STEM, you might know a lot about whatever STEM people do. I'm a social scientist, so you'll know a lot about that though. But the point of a postdoc is to either dive deeper into your topic or sometimes go laterally. Other than additional training, one of the important things that a postdoc gives you is more time. Chances are, if you're considering a postdoc, you are also on the academic job market. Now, depending on your field, if you're like in the social sciences, for example, you might have already been competitive enough for a faculty position, but you didn't get one, or you're not quite sure and you're hedging. If you're in STEM, chances are a postdoc is just something that you're going to have to do because it's more common in the STEM fields to do postdoc after your initial training. Either way, what a postdoc gives you is more time. It can be anywhere from a few months to a few years. And this additional time lets you do a bunch of things. It lets you publish more, develop more expertise, network more, or network at all if you weren't networking during your time as a PhD student. But time is something that is precious because it gives you that much more time to develop yourself. The other thing that shouldn't be overlooked about a postdoc is it's a job. It's the first job that you're going to get after your PhD, and probably the first time, especially if you went straight through, that you'll command a somewhat reasonable salary. And it's your first job after your PhD, so it's important to see it as this transition away from being a student and toward being a professional. So let's talk about what it means to be a postdoc and think about it through the lens of your first professional position. There are a number of considerations you should have when you're looking for postdoc positions, either casually or more seriously. One of the first questions you should ask about a postdoc position is the funding source. Where's the money coming from? Often on the faculty side, we will write postdoc positions into a grant because we need additional support. There are other postdocs that are funded differently. Some postdocs, for example, are funded through the university. Postdocs that are funded for projects are headed by a PI, the project is, and that postdoc supports the PI for that project. Postdocs that are funded through the university are funding a person. You might want to think about a postdoc that is funded through the university instead, and often they're sort of advertised as fellowship positions. Regardless if the position is funded by the university or by external money, it's important to think about the pros and cons of either situation. You might think, I would love to have free reign to basically have my funding to pursue the projects that I would like to pursue. This seems enticing, but it has its drawbacks. One of the drawbacks, for example, in my own situation was everything was up to me. I needed to find my own external money to fund my work. I needed to start from scratch and develop my entire research agenda. And I needed to do a lot of prep work to think about how I was going to turn this opportunity ultimately into what happened, which was becoming a professor. That is a lot of legwork and a lot of starting from scratch. And this might not be for you, especially if you're the type of person who is really comfortable with structure, who's a little bit more comfortable contributing to projects and learning on the job, as opposed to creating something from scratch. However, there are those of you who are probably entrepreneurial and would love the opportunity to build something new. However, know that when you're in charge, your failures are yours. And often that can be a lot of stress to put on yourself. On the other hand, if you're in a well-funded postdoc position, sometimes you'll be able to contribute to the main project and carve off just a little bit of it for yourself so that you can still develop your identity, all while learning additional things. That was actually one of the drawbacks to my situation. I did a lot of good work, I think, during those postdoc years, but one of the things that I didn't get to do was develop additional skills. I didn't have any formal opportunities to learn any new techniques that would have been supported by the project. I often went and found and cobbled together my own opportunities along these lines, but it wasn't quite the same. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about where the money's coming from for the postdoc position. If you happen to be awarded a position that's funded by the university, one of the first questions you should ask yourself is this a pipeline to potentially become faculty at this university? There are a few postdocs that is their entire purpose. For example, the University of California President's Postdoc, that is designed as a postdoc, but it also guarantees you a position within one of the University of California schools. So if you have that type of postdoc that's a fellowship, understand if it is a pipeline, how that pipeline works, because that's one of the things that you'll need to figure out quickly if you want to make the most out of the opportunity. Another consideration you should have is whether or not you will develop any new skills or expertise that I've hinted at. Will this position teach you something new, either through the project or more formally as some sort of training opportunity? Think about what sorts of opportunities are present and whether or not that's something that is of interest to you. If you're on the faculty side, as in you would like to become a faculty member and a professor one day, one of the most important things that you should consider for your postdoc position are publication opportunities. Because remember, postdocs aren't that long. They're anywhere from 1 to 3 years. Depending on the maturity of the project, there might not be as much time to publish, especially if the project's early on and you're just doing a lot of data collection, versus projects that are a little further along and you're sort of at that manuscript writing phase. So understand what the timeline is and what the opportunities to publish are. If you want to become a faculty member, chances are you might be thinking about funding. Will the postdoc train you in how to write grants? Some of these opportunities are informal. A PI, for example, might have a really good granting record where they're just constantly getting grant money. That should signal to you that they're actually pretty good at it. So you can learn from them by asking, or maybe they have these formal opportunities where you get to help write a grant. Either way, you want to sort of understand this space because that's a special skill and often it's not taught in the PhD program. Another consideration you should have is how much money will this postdoc pay you? Now, it's obviously not all about the money, but the postdoc is a job. So you need to have a sense of how much the salary is and whether or not that salary works in the area where you are, because especially for high cost of living areas, you actually might be in a situation where you just might not make enough money to live in a way that's comfortable, which will undermine your productivity. This isn't to say there aren't solutions. However, it's important for you to get a really good handle on the finances because, again, this is your first job. You're not going to have nearly as much support as a postdoc as you did as a PhD student. Another consideration that's important for you to keep in mind is how much time the postdoc is or will give you. Ideally, you want a postdoc that lasts at least 2 years, and here's why. If you just earned your PhD, chances are you defended it sometime in late spring or the summer, so you're done by the end of the summer. Your postdoc often starts that fall, so there isn't that much time to move and to acclimate, and if it's only a year postdoc, you immediately have to go back on the job market because positions are posted in early to late fall. So you don't even have that much time to go from learning a new system, learning your PI's lab, learning a new city, to going back out on the market. And that's a lot of stress. Outside of that stressful component, you actually probably also don't look that much different. You probably haven't published that much more in the months between graduating and your initial job market search the year before. So you don't have a lot to show for it. So you want that year to develop your research agenda and to publish more so that you're in a position that's stronger so that by year 2, you can actually be in a position of strength when you're back on the market. So ideally 2 years, however, we don't always have that choice. Sometimes we only get 1 year. So if it's 1 year, find ways to maximize that year and also immediately start asking if you can extend that postdoc for another year. Let's get into some red flags or things you should really think twice about when you're looking at a PhD. These red flags don't mean that you should immediately turn down a position or not even apply, but they're things that should make you perk up a little bit and ask follow-up questions. The first red flag that I alluded to earlier is it's too short. So if it's a year position, that's a bit of a red flag, but it's not a deal breaker because you can be productive in a year. It just requires a little bit more work on your part, and it requires you to do 2 things at once effectively. Do the postdoc and figure out what's happening next year. So it can be a very stressful time. An additional red flag you should think about is the reputation of the PI, specifically if they have a bad reputation. Now, by bad, I don't necessarily mean that they're the worst PI ever, that they're super toxic and they're going around kicking everyone. That's not what I mean. Obviously, if they're kicking people, don't go there. Yeah, just don't go there. It's a bad idea. But that's on the absurd negative end, right? There might be some things that sort of still give you pause. For example, are they a little bit vague when it comes to the project itself? Do they want to have you take the lead on everything without a lot of support? Do you sense from the other postdocs and other graduate students that are in their lab that they're somewhat hesitant or not engaging with the PI? Ask around. See where their students end up. See where their postdocs end up. If you know of some alums, contact them. You should know if the lab environment or the PI has a level of toxicity that you can't put up with. You should know that by asking a bunch of follow-up questions. And be wary of anything that feels like too much of a stretch. And definitely be wary if you've heard whispers or screams about the toxicity of the lab, because you're not going to be the person that beats the system or beats the toxicity. Toxicity has a way of just getting everywhere and even undermining the best of intentioned people. So if there's a reputation of toxicity, take it seriously and think about whether or not it's worth it, because you'll find often that you can't absorb that much toxicity. Everyone is going to be different, and there sometimes are reasons to put up with a little bit of stress because it'll put you in a position that will help propel you forward. But be careful, because it's not always cut and dry. The best, most world-renowned PIs might be very toxic. They're not always, and I would say they're not most of the time, but you should still think about it. Another thing that is a red flag that has nothing to do with the postdoc itself, but more to do with where you are in your own life, is the position is too disruptive. So here's a scenario. You just graduated, you have an offer from a PI to move across the country to start a one-year position. He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, if they have enough funding for a second year, but they still want you to be there. You know that it'll be expensive to move over, and it'll be a little bit stressful because you'll need to immediately start working on the project. These things are disruptions, and you'll find that sometimes even a really good position with good opportunities are too disruptive to your life, to the point where you actually wouldn't be productive in that environment. So think about that. Think about whether or not that move is a good move on paper versus whether it's a good move as you sort of game it out and think about what your day-to-day might be like. Be wary of anything that's too disruptive. Often as academics, we err on the side of making the decision that's best for our career while we ignore other aspects of our life. And in my view, that's very dangerous, because we become one-dimensional and so obsessed with the profession that we forget that there's life that happens outside of it. What about your partner? If you have children, what about them? If you have pets, will they like the move? My cat moved from Michigan. She was fine with it, but it was not a fun ride.
All right.
So just think about that. And that's a minor disruption, obviously. And she's actually a happy California cat now. But either way, think about that. And think about whether or not that disruption is worth it from a career perspective and from a life perspective. So what do you think? Are there other things that I missed that's worth getting into? Put that in the comments. Let's share that knowledge.